Okay, well, hey, welcome to sociology. And we're going to start with chapter one and kind of track a little bit with your book. I'm going to kind of focus on highlighting specifics and maybe expanding perspectives on key points. So let's take a look and we'll go into the slideshow here. Okay, so this is from the real world, an introduction to sociology. The seventh edition. Now, again, if you remember, you can get the sixth or fifth edition, and it's going to be pretty close to the same. Usually they update maybe some data, a couple stories, making it a little more relevant, but you can get the key points. Okay, so sociology basics. What are the basics we're going to talk about in today's lecture? We're going to talk about what is sociology, sociological perspective and the beginner's mind, which is really important to understanding kind of the overall ground perspective. The sociological lens is what I call it sometimes, using your sociological imagination, very similar to those last two. Where are sociology's roots? Free will versus determinism. Paradigms, which are the sociological approaches. Okay, they're theoretically based, right, to some degree, but there are approaches, and we'll talk about that. And those are functionalism or structural functionalism, conflict theory, or sometimes what's referred to as critical theory, and interactionism, sometimes referred to also as symbolic interactionism. The other thing I would say too, as we go through this, is to consider maybe taking a break or pausing. You don't have to go through this whole thing at the same time continuously. You can do a great thing about recorded lectures is that you can take a break. Also, you can take notes. You can pause, you can stop, you can rewind to listen again to different key points. You can reference your book. You can stop and reference your book or get online and search or go to Crash Course Sociology. I mean, there's a lot of different ways you can gain information and knowledge to greater depths using technology. All right, so let's move on. So what is sociology? Sociology it's a systematic or scientific study. So it is based on science and it is systematic and very important. And what are we studying? Human society and social behavior. Okay, social behavior. And it's from a large scale, institutions and mass culture, right? So a very macro approach to small groups and individual interactions, how we influence and interact with each other, how we influence social institutions, culture, and structures, and how those structures then influence us. Okay, we'll talk about what a social institution is or a social structure later in this lecture. And then society. Society is a group of people, so two or more people, who shape their lives in aggregated and patterned ways. So aggregated means you're taking the whole and you're measuring or aggregating, you're looking for patterns, patterned ways that distinguish their group from others. Right? So what sociology in its simplest form is, it studies, let's say, male and female, two different groups. And it says, okay, these are aggregated groups, an aggregated group of males, an aggregated group of females. We measure, say, something as simple as height, or, which is more biological, but for this purpose, it's probably easier. We measure height of men, height of women. You're going to get bell-shaped curves, and there's going to be overlapping. Not all men are taller than all women, and not all women are shorter than all men, right? But you get an aggregate or an average, and then you compare the groups. And then if there's a difference, you go, ooh, there's a difference between these groups, right? Let's say black and white, right? As far as race goes, and we talk about education levels, or we talk about household incomes. So those are some of the things that we do as sociologists. And so we study, right, a person in context to being influenced from a larger group. Now, social sciences, which is where sociology fits under, is the social sciences, are the disciplines that use a scientific method to examine the social world. So when we talk about the social world, we're talking about human beings and their interactions. We're talking about groups and their interactions and the effect of groups on an individual and groups interacting with other groups, social sciences. Now, using the sociological perspective in the beginner's mind, you see a very, I don't know, what do you notice about this picture? Maybe her hairstyle, her hair color, her skin, maybe how she's, has her arms up, maybe something about her dress. I don't know, do you notice anything else? Well, using the sociological perspective, right, we try to see, and the beginner's mind, right, is we try to shed our biases and our preconceived notions, right? And to some degree, we look at this picture and we go, well, it looks normal. We kind of see, not that people walk around, with their hands over their head, but we look around and she seems normal, or what we would consider normal. And then we look at this picture and we go, oh, look at the hair on that girl's armpits. Of course, biologically, that's natural, right? Sociologically, that is what we call deviating from the social norms, and those social norms are constructed. So using the beginner's mind, right, we can look at differences and we can go, well, now wait a second, let me think about this, take a look at this, and really determine, is this socially constructed? Is it influenced by people? So the fact that we look at the girl with hairy armpits and we go, maybe we react, right? Which means that which indicates that this could be a violation of social norms. So using your sociological perspective, that lens, and the beginner's mind, we can sometimes see that what seems to be normal may not be as normal, or it's socially constructed and we've normalized it. Okay. So we will use these images throughout the course to kind of reference as a reference or anchor point throughout the term, just because it's seems to be a pretty good visual of applied concepts. Okay, the sociological imagination, right? So Goffman, a 20th century sociologist, mid to late 20th century, his perspective was that we use the sociological imagination, and one of the examples that he gave was the difference between a personal problem and a social problem. So if it's one person and that is, say, unemployed or homeless, it's a personal problem. But when that problem grows and gains commonality amongst a growing population, it becomes a social problem. So, and then using the sociological imagination, we might consider, and Goffman encourages us to consider, because what might be influences that result in somebody being homeless or out of work, unemployed, or whatever the condition is. And so if, we may commonly think in our culture, well, because the person's lazy or drug addicted, or which might be true, that might be an individual reason. But using the sociological imagination, Goffman asks us to think in terms of greater macro influences and forces that, like a downturn in the economy, or maybe a culture that's so techno coming at us that it's overwhelming psychologically and creates an overwhelmingness to function in society for a certain percentage of the population. So that's the sociological imagination, Goffman. Also, not only do we study, I can't think of it, but part of what we do in sociology, we just don't study homeless people. We don't just study the poor, we study the rich, we study everyone in society, even Bezos, which sometimes people are like, I don't like that guy, that Bezos guy. But his behaviors and his thinking and his actions and the way he dresses and looks and acts are also influenced by society. Okay. And we don't just study We study both the priests and the prostitutes, as one famous sociologist said. We don't just study one or the other, we study all, right? And we try to use the beginner's mind and the sociological imagination to consider what might be the social, structural, cultural, institutional influence and forces, right, that create behaviors like, in people that behave like Bezos, all right? Sociological roots in the Industrial Revolution. This is from an old, I think it was probably in the 70s or 80s, Little House on the Prairie, which was a very famous book series that was early Industrial Revolution, but mostly still people were on the farm. And sociology's roots are connected with the Industrial Revolution, and I'll explain that in a second, right? So you have this, happy farm family, it's a series on TV and it's happy, and, there's challenges, but in the end, everybody's happy. And of course, some of you might remember, this is the older version of Mary Poppins, but the chimney sweep and all the smoke, and this was in England's, and the Industrial Revolution rose first in England and quickly was emulated in the United States. But all the smoke that you see in the chimney sweep, that's the Industrial Revolution. A lot of factories and poverty and child labor and things like that in the early part of the Industrial Revolution. So in real life, right, we had a lot of people that lived on the farm, and the invention of the cotton gin and the steam engine created the mechanisms that led to an industrialized nation, which then moved people from over a few decades from the farm into the cities, because they needed a way to continue to make money. And a lot of the farm life, because the Industrial Revolution and cottage industries in the off seasons of farming, cottage industries became obsolete to some degree, or pressure was put on them by factories. Because if say there was a cottage industry of making blankets, like quilts in the winter, and you could maybe make a half a dozen quilts over a winter when you weren't farming, you had more time, what they call a cottage industry, right, on the farm. The Industrial Revolution, steam engines could power these giant weaving lathes machines, and could pump out 6 quilts an hour, right? So the value, right, the more supply you have that you're putting into the economy, the less when there's an oversupply to the demand, then the price drops. And all of a sudden, you couldn't make the cottage industries on the farm couldn't make a living to supplement the farm, so they had to go move into the city. And of course, the factories needed workers. So this massive shift was happening, and people were going into cities, child labor, in industry, and also lots of people moving into very close confines, next on top of each other, next to each other. It was a different society, a different way of life. People were concerned, oh my gosh, this thing's changing. And so you had economists, political scientists, philosophers, you had educated people, sometimes in the medical or scientific or bio, studying. I had a lot of philosophers and political scientists studying all of a sudden society, and they named this thing sociology. Durkheim named it sociology. Comte, who's considered like the Western father of sociology, right, brought this perspective of a positivist perspective. So it was right on in the time of the scientific revolution, coming out of a religious culture. So let's talk a little bit about free will and determinism. Most people, it's kind of framed as an either or argument. People tend to like, oh, it's free will. No, it's determinism. It's determinism. No, it's free will. And, or sometimes people will be like, well, it's if we get a little bit more complex, it's a spectrum. It's a little of this and some of that, or a lot of this and a little of that. And it kind of is framed as like this either or, which is a fallacy as far as an argument goes. But we we tend to think in up, down, high, low, rich, poor, black, white. Anyway, I was talking to Matt Novak, who teaches psychology. We were talking about this free will and determinism, and he shared it's both at the same time, right? And the yoke is kind of this free will, right? And determinism is outside forces, right? So the egg yolk sits within the egg white. So we as people sit within our society. We have our free will, right? But then we do have influences because we sit inside at the same time, we sit inside society. And there are influences, that society affects us. And so that's what sociology really is looking at individuals and the yolk and seeing within that society of the egg white, what kind of influence does society have on us? And we sometimes like to think it has no effect on me. I make my own decisions, right? And so using the beginner's mind, we try to end the sociological imagination, and you create hypotheses. We'll talk about that in the next chapter. But we want to look at what are those influences on human beings based on interaction with people, groups, social institutions. Okay, now this is a good time to take a break, maybe stand up or pause and come back later, because we're going to talk about the sociological approaches. So there's three sociological approaches: structural functional, or structural functionalism, or functionalism. The second one is conflict theory, and the last one is symbolic interactionism, or interactionism. And we'll talk about those in the next few slides. Okay, these are paradigms, they're frameworks, they're lenses. That's why I put that camera lens up there, right? And they're all different tools to view or see society, to study society. Just like somebody, you would change the lenses depending on what as a tool for what they're trying to accomplish. Okay, so they're different paradigms, and this can be challenging, right? Because coming out of high school and into college, right, can be challenging because you understand theories and concepts, but these are paradigms and frameworks, or what I call lenses that we and it's just like, yeah, I have reading glasses, but I also might have sunglasses, right? Or I might have some other kind, and we even like sunglasses, we can use different lenses for driving versus sports versus some other. So there's different uses for these different sociological approaches. So let's take a look at functionalism first. Functionalism, and let's just take a look at the definition. Okay, it is a paradigm or a framework or a lens, right? That sees. So this lens, you see society as a complex system. Okay, a complex system of government and education and family and culture, healthcare and the economy, right? And in this complex system, right? These different parts that they work together, okay, to promote stability and solidarity. Because as humans, the idea behind functionalism is human beings want stability. We don't like panic and anxiety and uncertainty, right? So we create these structures, these social structures, we create them in order to promote stability. And we like solidarity. We like people that kind of agree, because solidarity encourages stability, okay? And it's a macro level orientation. We're looking at the bigger picture. It's macro, okay? And we look at social structures, right? Social structures. We look at and think of a building, or think of other structures in our society: bridges, dams, airports, right? Built tall buildings. Those are structures. We built those structures, like say a dam, to create a reservoir for the purpose of, oh, maybe collecting hydroelectric power in Oregon, right? We're big into hydroelectric power. So we build a dam to create, it also functions, right? Not only to, and its purpose is not only to create power, which is beneficial for society, right? But it also helps with flood control and irrigation. So there is intended functions, and then there are latent or other additional functions, right? So we create social structures in the same way for purposes to better society, right? Stability and solidarity, right? We create education. We create a criminal justice system. We create government, right? And these social institutions provide functions to serve us, not only individuals, but from a macro perspective, we want to look at how they serve society. What benefits do they bring society? Okay, so what social functions, how do they function in society to create a better society that promotes stability and solidarity? And another way to look at it is, what about social problem solving, right? What problem, right? So a dam solves the problem of flooding, or a bridge solves a problem of how to get from one side of the canyon or creek or river to the other side, right? So what problem, for example, does the criminal justice system solve, right? That's a good question, right? So one way to look at it would be, well, if we didn't have this social structure, in this case, if we didn't have a criminal justice system, or let's even say like a police force, if we didn't have a police force, what would happen, right? We've heard about, defund the police, and in areas where they've defunded the police, what happens to crime rates? Crime rates go up, right? How are we going to solve that problem? Well, we can reinvent it, right? Which is part of functionalism, is that there is, when something changes, right? Functionalist perspective is that it has a symbiosis. It moves to try to solve that problem, because we want to move toward reforming or adjusting social structures that better promote stability and solidarity. Okay, so it's social problem solving, and it reports what is. It's what Kant calls positivism, right? Which basically says what positivism is we're only going to believe what we can measure, and we're just looking for the facts, just the facts, man. Functionalism reports what is. It studies society to find out what's happening, just the facts, right? It's based on positivism, measurable, statistical, quantitative perspective, right? The strengths and weaknesses are that because it's trying to just find out what it is, right? The strengths are that it is low in bias. It is low in bias, and it is a macro perspective, right? The weaknesses are that it tends to overlook inequalities. It'll recognize them, but it's not going to spend a lot of time trying to highlight those inequalities for the purpose of bringing equity, right? It's just going to say, hey, here it is. There's a difference between these groups, and then it moves on, right? And also the weakness of functionalism, which is the opposite of its strengths, right? So it's a macro strength. So it sometimes can also not look as hard at the micro levels of individual or small groups, right? Because you're looking at social structures. Although we do look, functionalists do look, or people that use a functionalist perspective can look at how social structures influence individuals. So it does do that. The seminal thinkers, right? The seminal scientists or seminal thinkers, Comte, Durkheim, and Spencer. And Spencer likened the human body, or any kind of a living system or an ecosystem, or to society, that there are different parts, and these parts function together to create a stable and solid society. And he said that's true of the human body. These different body parts work together to function, to help maintain a stable human being. And he also looked at living systems or ecosystems, like say a pond, where you had different parts in a lake or a pond. You had fish and frogs and polywogs and algae and all kinds of different living systems within the larger living system, and it functioned, right, to promote a stable ecosystem within a pond. And if things changed, right, because of some kind of a force that made the, then it would adjust, right, and create a new normal and function again, because that's what and functionalism tends to be based on a foundation of biology. So it's going to be a little bit more essentialist, biological, in its kind of underpinnings. Okay, so that's functionalism. Application of functionalism, let's talk about how someone would see education, or using the lens of functionalist, or using the paradigm or the framework. How would a functionalist generally see education? Well, what's the purpose of education? How does it function to promote stability and solidarity? That's a good question. Okay, let's see. How about it helps to socialize good citizens? It helps to equip workers for society, right? So if we get all on the same page, right, you learn how to shake hands, you learn how to raise your hand, you learn how to treat other people with respect, you learn how to not be a bully or how to deal with a bully, you learn about the culture, you learn about the social norms, and you come out of high school and hopefully, there's a lot more good citizens and good workers, and that promotes a benefit for society. Okay, that's how it functions in society. You also tend to, it stratifies, right? It works as a stratification system, right? Different levels, different fields of study. So those are some of the functionalist perspectives applied to education. Okay, let's move on to conflict theory, or sometimes people call it critical theory. Conflict theory. Okay, let's look at the definition. It sees society. So it uses the lens of the paradigm, and it sees society as this arena of inequality. And that inequality, right, it generates conflict. And through that conflict, it creates change. Okay. So it's a Marxist dialectic of, you have a thesis, right, which is the status quo, and you have a challenge to the status quo, which is called an antithesis. And there's this conflict, right? And out of that conflict, it creates change, and we call that there's a synthesis. And that synthesis then becomes the new thesis. And then it happens again, and it keeps happening. And Marx, the ideology behind conflict theory is eventually we will move forward in society to this utopian culture where things are working smoothly, and it focuses. It's a macro perspective, but let's go through some of the characteristics of conflict theory. So it is a macro level orientation, and it tends to look not at social structures as much as Marx from the beginning looked at the social structure of an economic system, right? So capitalism was his focus. It says capitalism creates inequality. That was the philosophy. If there's any of the three sociological approaches that is heavy into philosophy or a belief system, it's conflict theory or critical theory, right? And critical theory says that that there's these inequalities, right? So it's a macro level, and it focuses on social structures, mostly from an economic, but then folded under that through the decades in sociology. We've also folded in critical race theory, feminist theory, and queer theory, and other theories of inequality, right? So it's a macro level orientation. It's the dialectic or historical materialism, right? Which is that thesis, antithesis, change to develop what a synthesis, which becomes the new thesis. And then that thesis has an antithesis that, right? Okay. And it just keeps going, right? That's the dialectic. That's the dialectic. Okay, conflict between classes and groups. Why are there conflicts between classes and groups? You could look at some biological reasons for that, but Marx says the reason is because these groups, right, have unequal power, and they're what? Competing for limited resources. They're competing. There's only so many resources of food, and usually Marx said wealth was his thing, but then Weber or Weber, right, a German sociologist, Weber, or it's pronounced Weber in Germany. Weber comes along and he says not only wealth, but also status and power. So from a conflict perspective, everything goes back to competing, right, in groups, right? You're part of a group that's competing for, whether it's male versus female, white versus black versus brown versus, or rich versus poor, which is where the original, the bourgeoisie of the rich and the proletariat of the working class poor, right? Competing for these limited resources of power, status, and wealth. Okay, and it results in unequal outcome and conflict. Okay, so you have groups with different, and that's what we're doing, studying groups that are competing for scarce resources. I want my piece of the pie. They want their piece of the pie. My tribe wants my piece. Well, even politics, right? Democrats, Republicans, they all want what political power. And so they're competing, and it results in unequal outcomes. Okay, we talked about wealth, power, and status. The strengths of conflict theory is the whole purpose that someone would use conflict theory as a lens or framework to study society is because they want to bring about change. They see an inequity or an inequality, and they're going to shine a light on change, on inequality for the purpose of change. Okay, so the strength is trying to change society for a better tomorrow. Right now, the weakness is you can sometimes get so enthusiastic and passionate about change that the bias increases, so yeah, and we've had a shift from quantitative research to a qualitative research, and that increases the likelihood of bias as well. And so the weakness is it can be biased, right? And it's also a macro perspective. So, and the other weakness of conflict theory too is when you shine a light and you talk about the inequalities and you want change, you're trying to change society. Who are you trying to? You're trying to help the oppressed or the underclass, right? Who are you trying to? Who's that going to affect the most in a negative way? The people in power structures, the wealthy, the rich, the people that have power, right? And so there's that you can ramp up the conflict in many places, right? Marx or Marxism has created revolution. Well, a lot of people die when there's a revolution, right? So in order to change the power structure, sometimes millions, tens of millions of people have ended up dying throughout history, even just in the 20th century. Okay, so Karl Marx, Jane Addams in the area of feminism, W.E.B. Du Bois in the area of critical race theory. The book's got some good stuff on that. You can read about that. Great stuff. W.E.B. Du Bois was one of the early, he's often labeled as a founder, but he was certainly one of the first early of the NAACP, right? And of course, there's a picture of Karl Marx, fascinating human being, probably even though he lived in the 1800s, probably influenced the 20th century, maybe, or certainly the second half of the 20th century, maybe more than any single human being. The Soviet Union was influenced by Marx. China and their communist revolution was influenced by Marx. So anyway, yeah, a lot of interesting. Yeah, that's a whole nother lecture. That you won't get into that, but all right. So that's conflict theory. Okay, how do we apply conflict theory in the same space. So earlier we talked about applying functionalism to education. Now let's apply conflict theory to education. So what's the resource? Education, right? Access to, and what's the degrees, and how does that resource, that scarce resource of education, or good education, or Harvard degree education, results in, right, power, status, and wealth, right? So that's the scarce resource that people are. There's only so many seats in Harvard. There's only so many seats in the best public, K through 12 schools, right? And to get into that school district, I know, like I have a buddy that lives in Dallas, and the prices of real estate, just an apartment or a condo, just to get into that school district, right? It's hard to even get. So even access to resources, right? So education is a resource. Are there groups? We can measure groups based on socioeconomic status, which is kind of what I just alluded to, right? Being able to have equal access to good education, right? If you're poor, right, you don't have as much power to gain access to that as the rich. You can also divide groups by race and ethnicity, there's all, maybe rural versus urban versus suburban. And so there's unequal access. Those that have the most power tend to get the most resources out of that to a certain degree. And that creates, or can create, right, levels of conflict, right? And we've seen a lot of studies over the decades of outcomes of education based on race and ethnicity, based on social class, based on rural or suburban or urban, based on gender, right? Math scores for women and boys and girls in high school, that kind of thing. So that's what conflict theory, that's the lens that you use to study education in this application. Okay. Let's talk about interactionism. Interactionism is let's look at it's a paradigm or a lens or a way of viewing society. It sees society using this lens. It sees society as a product of everyday interactions of individuals. So the influence that we have on each other through interaction. Let's break it down a little bit more. It's a micro-orientation. It's a social construction of meaning. And we'll talk about that in a second. So what does a social construction of meaning look like if we deconstruct it? You start with a symbol, and a symbol is anything. Okay, a symbol is anything we can give meaning to. Whoa, man, that's pretty impressive. So a symbol can be a stop sign. A symbol can be hey, this iPhone is a symbol, right? This iPhone is a symbol, and it has a different meaning, right, than a Galaxy phone, right? My shirt is a symbol, right? If I have a polo shirt versus a Izod versus a Nike versus, so all these anything, ideas we can give meaning to, right? Freedom, we give meaning to that word and that idea, right? So a symbol is anything we can give meaning to, which is pretty much anything. A person, a skin color, a hairstyle, a gender, right? All those things are symbols that we give meaning to. Wow, pretty cool. Okay, and then through interaction, right? How do I learn the meaning of like I have coffee and I'm drinking it out of a mug, but it's not Starbucks. It's not, how about Starbucks versus Dutch Bros, right? How do you know what kind of people prefer Starbucks and what kind of people prefer Dutch Bros? And how do you, there's this social construction of meaning that we give to symbols, but it happens, we learn that through interaction, through socialization, right? And then out of that comes meaning, and then we act on that meaning, right? We act on that meaning. If we see somebody driving a truck on the Bend bypass, right? and it's all jacked up. And so we'd probably give that and associate that with the driver, but we have a different meaning for a jacked up truck, say with an American flag, or, flying off the back, versus say like a van, right, carrying a family, right? We act based on that meaning, right? What happens when somebody, cuts in front of you? Do you feel differently if it's the truck versus the soccer mom van? Even the fact that I put soccer mom van on that's part of what? The meaning through interaction. Okay, and so meaning changes over time, right? The things that used to mean something 20 years ago might mean something different today. So meanings change, and different meanings for different groups, right? We might see football, as an example, as a sport. We might see that as a great American institution, and other people see it as a form of violence and unnecessary activity. Okay, different groups, right? Again, we're all about groups, see it differently. Okay, strengths and weaknesses. The strengths of interactionism is it helps us to see the social construction of meaning and how we respond and act is a very micro perspective. So strengths is it's a micro perspective, okay, that focuses on the influence of interaction. Its weaknesses are that it doesn't, that it's not, of course, macro, right? Doesn't take in, it kind of overlooks social structures and inequalities. It kind of overlooks those as influences, and because it's focused on the micro, and it also tends to be somewhat biased as well, and certainly not as unbiased as functionalism. So those are the three approaches. Max Weber, George Herbert Mead, and Herbert Blummer were the seminal thinkers in interactionism. You can read about them, kind of interesting. I don't want to get too bogged down in too many details in a lecture, but those guys, pretty amazing guys. Weber or Weber, right, the German guy. Okay, let's apply it to school. So interactionism, right? So let's pick a symbol, right? You always start with a symbol, right? The symbol is, let's say, a teacher in college. Let's say a professor, right? So the symbol is professor. Okay, what meaning do we give professor? Maybe smart, fair, just, knowledgeable. I don't know, maybe some other derogatory words. I don't know, but we don't want to pick on one. The symbol is professor, right? And then how do we act based on that? So when you interact with the professor, or you find, say, somebody that you know, all of a sudden you go, "Ooh, he's a PhD, he's a doctor, he's got his doctorate, he's a college professor." Do you all of a sudden see that person differently? And then because of that meaning that you've learned through interaction, you act differently, right? So you act based on that meaning, okay? And or somebody that, say, has a degree, say has a Harvard degree versus someone that didn't graduate from high school. Do you treat that person differently based on the meaning that we've given a person that has that label? Right? Kind of interesting, right? And then different groups give different meanings, right? I mean, I have friends that say a PhD stands for piled higher and deeper, like crap, piled higher and deeper BS, right? So yeah, it's interesting, right? And that meaning changes over time, right? So that's how we would apply interactionism to education. I mean, you could have picked an apple, you could have picked a student, you could have picked a school book, a diploma, a desk, anything that is a symbol that has meaning, and that's where you start. So let's do a quick review, and I'm going to go through this really quick, right? Because we've already covered it once. But how do we use the tool or the application or the lens of these? So functionalism. Choose a social structure or an aspect or idea of society or culture. So you choose a social structure like the criminal justice system, education, which we did, healthcare, family, culture. You choose a social structure. You identify its function or purpose to the greater macro society. What is the benefit or the purpose, right? And then how does that social structure or that aspect of society, how does that promote stability and solidarity? Okay, so that was conflict. That was the 3 quick, boom, there it is. Okay, conflict theory. You identify a source, right? Maybe in the criminal justice system, maybe it's justice, right? Justice, right? Or social control, right? Of enforcing the laws, but justice, right? Identify groups that are competing for the same resource. Might be based on race, right? Identify unequal access to resources and outcomes. So you identify these unequal accesses to these same resource, the different groups, and then consider reasons for the disparities that are based on or include power, wealth, and status, okay? So that is conflict theory. All right, quick review of interactionism. Identify a symbol, anything that can be given a meaning. Identify the socially constructed meaning that's given to it by the dominant culture, okay? And then identify meaning constructed by other groups. What are some of the other subordinate groups or subcultural groups? What meaning do they give it? And it may be the same or it may be different. And then consider how this meaning may have changed or is changing in meaning over time, and consider how groups and individuals act or react to other groups or individuals based on those symbols or those attached meanings, right, to people based on the meanings of those symbols. Okay, so pretty cool. Give yourself a little bit of a break on getting this all down today. These are the themes that kind of run through sociology, these 3 main sociological approaches. So why do we study sociology? It helps us to assess the truth of what we consider common sense and or popular beliefs, right? So be ready to have some of our beliefs challenged, right? And that challenging is a dialectic in and of itself, right? That gets us to a more accurate space and then helps us see opportunities and constraints in our lives, right? It helps us to see pathways forward, opportunities, pipelines of opportunities, and the constraints based on our social locations. And we'll talk about social locations later. Empowers us to be active within our society. So better understanding our society can help us not only navigate, but empowers us to be active within it and helps us to live in a diverse world, because we can see, hopefully, we can understand better other people's, their social locations and the influences that they have on them, and maybe why they might act, think, behave, express themselves the way they do based on influences. Okay, so that is the first lecture, a lot, right? So a lot coming at you, and but I think we're going to have a great term. So keep up the good work, and we'll see you for the next lecture or see you in class on Zoom. All right, talk to you later.